Hi, welcome to day 2 of the What's the Stitch challenge. I am taking advantage of what is probably the last of our warm weather this year by wearing my black and polka dot dress and my small boots today, as well as my light kind of jacket, my black leather jacket, because it's a little chilly this morning. So today I'm going to talk about the 8 biggest impacts of fashion on the environment, and I will just give you a quick overview of what those impacts are. Fashion is the second most polluting industry in the world according to the UN, so it obviously has a very, very large impact on our planet. So the first of the 8 big environmental impacts is water pollution. 20% of global water waste comes from the textile industry, according to the UN. So chemicals like lead, mercury, arsenic, and other very harmful chemicals are often in textile wastewater. Those are chemicals used to treat fabric, used for dyeing fabric, and they have a huge, huge effect on people and the planet. People in local environments where those chemicals are dumped into rivers are deeply affected, and those chemicals are eventually, of course, carried into the ocean and distributed across the world. And on that note, chemicals are the second impact that I'm going to talk about today. 23% of all chemicals used in manufacturing are from the textile industry, and those chemicals have a big impact on farmers in terms of pesticides for growing cotton and things such as that, or on communities in general. Those pesticides get into the air, or chemicals are dumped in rivers and affect food and water supplies for local communities, and those products even reach us with a certain impact from chemicals. When you buy clothing that nobody's worn before, it's come straight from the factory, often there are still remnants of those chemicals in the fabric, and when we put them on our body, our skin, which is of course the largest organ in our body, takes in some of those chemicals, and they have a negative effect on consumers around the world as well. The third impact I'm talking about today is water consumption. So according to the UN, it can take up over 10,000 liters of water to produce 1 kilogram of cotton, which is only the amount necessary for 1 pair of jeans. And that amount of water, 10,000 liters, is the amount that the average person would drink over 10 years. So the amount of water used to grow a lot of the materials that we use, to dye a lot of the materials we use, is astronomical, and the fashion industry uses 1.5 trillion liters of water every single year. And the next impact on the environment from the fashion industry is microplastics, which get into our oceans. So the fashion industry releases 190,000 tons of textile microplastics into the ocean every single year. Microplastics are pieces of plastic that come off of clothing that's made of synthetic materials, so something like polyester. So every time you wash something made of one of those synthetic materials, those microplastics get mixed up into the water from your washer and eventually make their way out into the ocean. So washing those items, which are up to 72% of clothing made of synthetic materials, has a huge negative impact on ocean wildlife and also on us, because those microplastics often make their way back into our food through animals and plants in the ocean, and we then consume them. So next up is waste accumulation. 85% of textiles and clothing goes into landfill. Only 15% is reused, recycled, donated, anything like that. And those items can take up to 200 years to decompose if they're made of synthetic materials. And as they decompose, they release methane gas, which is a greenhouse gas much, much more potent than CO2. So it's very important to pay attention to where our clothing is going when we get rid of it, and to try to consume less so that we don't have to get rid of as much clothing. Next up is greenhouse gases. Greenhouse gases obviously come from the release of gas from that clothing in landfills, but also from production, manufacturing, and transport of clothing in the fashion industry. So 10% of global carbon emissions are from the fashion industry, and the fossil fuels and coal used to produce those items also have an enormous impact. And to make matters worse, the final two items on this list do only negate our ability to help reduce our carbon impact. So number 7 is rainforest or general deforestation. This is largely due to wood-based fabrics like rayon, viscose, and modal, and we cut down 70 million trees every year for clothes. So this is a huge impact on our ability to have trees on the ground, which can absorb back some of those greenhouse gases, which are causing our global warming and so many other negative impacts in the environment. And while forest using wood as a material can be done in a sustainable way, which is demonstrated in the UN video Made in Forests, which I will link below, it is very difficult to make sure that those trees are replaced back in their natural ecosystem. And finally, soil degradation is also a huge impact from the fashion industry. This is mostly due to overgrazing from sheep and goats for things like wool and cashmere. Those chemicals that we use seep into the soil and negatively affect it, and deforestation plays a role in soil degradation as well. And soil is another thing which absorbs CO2 from the atmosphere, so the degradation of that soil again has an enormous impact. And I know that all of this can seem really bleak, but there are a few things that we can do to help reduce these impacts, and it mostly boils down to the main rule of buy less and buy better. So in terms of buy less, you take care of your clothing, make sure you mend your clothing, wash it properly so that it lasts you longer and you don't have to buy as many things. And then buy less in the first place. Know what you want, know what you really like, and buy less clothing. And more sustainable clothing is the buy better portion, where you can look at what brands are, look at fair trade brands, look at sustainable brands that take into account the environmental impact of their clothing, use natural fibers, particularly organic natural fibers that don't use chemicals, use fibers that use less water. So while cotton is a natural fiber, something like linen or hemp will use less water. And then also look at using your items for a longer period of time. For example, if you use an item of clothing 5 times rather than say 50 times, you are having a 400% greater impact on carbon emissions because you're more likely to buy other clothing. You're not using that piece of clothing enough to outweigh the cost of production. And another great way to look at this is the 30-day rule, which I will be covering in more detail later in the week. But basically it says that any piece of clothing you buy, you should be planning to wear at least 30 times. So those are just some basic things to keep in mind when considering the environmental impact of clothing. And I will be covering a lot more later in the week, more tips and tricks on how you can adjust your own habits. So thanks for tuning in to day 2 of What's the Stitch, and I will talk to you all tomorrow. Bye!